This episode is brought to you by the Sterling Soap Company. I'm a big fan of shave soap. I've been using different brands for years, and I recently gave Sterling's shave soaps a try, and I've been very happy with the results. Sterling's shave soaps give you a great lather and a frictionless feel that allows the razor to glide right over the skin for a super close shave. No skin irritation and a clean, refreshing feel with no soapy residue after. I can tell you without a doubt, it's simply the best shave I've ever had. And my wife has noticed too. And here's the thing. With the ability to purchase 1-ounce sample pucks, you can try out different scents to find the right one for you. Give Sterling Soap a try today. Visit sterlingsoap.com. That's STIRLING soap.com.
Hey there, sports history fan. Arnie Chapman here from the Sports History Network. Now, before you jump into this episode, I wanted to share with you an exciting giveaway we have going on with Home Field Apparel. We have a digital $50 gift card to homefieldapparel.com for one lucky fan of the Sports History Network. All you got to do is head over to sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways to sign up. Again, that's sportshistorynetwork.com/giveaways. This podcast is part of the Sports History Network, your headquarters for the yesteryear of your favorite sport. You can learn more at sportshistorynetwork.com.
Opening its doors in 1975, the Louisiana Superdome has become more than just the home of the New Orleans Saints and the yearly site of the Sugar Bowl. For the last 50 years, the Superdome, the most recognizable stadium for sure in the Western Hemisphere, has been the location of some of the most memorable games and sports moments over the last half century. This week, the now Caesars Superdome will be hosting the Super Bowl for a record 8th time, adding to its reputation as America's premier locale for big games and championship matches. Hello once again, fans. I'm Dana Augusta, your host of the Historically Speaking Sports podcast here on the Sports History Network. And in this edition of the show, we will highlight the previous Super Bowls held at the Superdome. Joining us in this episode is a pair of colleagues from right here on the Sports History Network. The host of the Football is Family podcast, Jeremy McFarland, and the co-host of the Hello Old Sports podcast, Dan Newman. They will sit down with me to talk about the best moments of Super Bowls in the Superdome, as well as share their memories of a building that has hosted more than its fair share of big games in North American sports. Later in the show, we'll send a shout out to the stadium that the Superdome replaced in the mid-1970s. A stadium known in the Big Easy as the Old Lady of Willow Street, Tulane Stadium. A stadium that was the site of the 3 Super Bowls in its own right, as well as the longtime home of the Sugar Bowl, the original home of the Saints, and was also the site of 1 or 2 of the greatest moments in Saints history. So sit back, put up your feet as we get ready for Super Bowl 59 by taking a trip back to the past Super Bowls in the Superdome. Once again, this is the Historically Speaking Sports podcast, the podcast that gives you the best of sports from back in the day, right here on the Sports History Network.
We here at the Sports History Network proudly partner with 26 podcasts, all revolving around the history of sports. But did you know that many of our hosts were sports history authors way before they started their shows? It's true. We've got Joe Ziemba, host of When Football Was Football, Joe Zagurski, host of Pro Football in the 1970s, Mark Morthier, host of Yesterday Sports, Tommy Phillips, host of Lombardi Memories, and Scott Adamson, co-host of From the 55-Yard Line. All these authors have many books for you to choose from. To check them out, go to our website at sportshistorynetwork.com/sportshistorybooks. Pick up your copy today.
This Sunday, the Super Bowl will return once again to the Caesars Superdome for a record eighth time. And since its opening in 1975, the Superdome has become one of the most recognizable sports arenas in the world. It has hosted everything from Super Bowls to Final Fours to heavyweight championship fights and even a couple of WrestleManias. And for the last 50 years, the Superdome has been more than just the home field of the New Orleans Saints and the Sugar Bowl. It has also become America's big game palace. And joining us tonight to discuss the Super Bowls that have taken place in this palace on Poydras Street is the host of the Football is Family podcast, Mr. Jeremy McFarland. Jeremy, thank you for coming on with us.
Thank you, Dana, for having me on.
And also joining us is the co-host of the Hello Old Sports podcast, Mr. Dan Newman.
Dana, good to see you. You've guested on my podcast many times, so really glad to return the favor.
Man, look, I'm glad to have both of you very knowledgeable gentlemen on. Y'all both have great, outstanding podcasts as members of the Sports History Network, and I'm so thankful to have you guys on this Sunday night. The Sunday, kind of like the dead Sunday, the Sunday before the Super Bowl as we're recording this. And let's just start things off with this, something very simple. When somebody mentions the Superdome, Dan, I'm going to start with you. What is one of the first things that come to mind when you think of the Superdome?
You know, it's funny. When I think of the Superdome, I just think of the Saints because I think that it really, for the longest time, the Saints were the only team, the only professional team in New Orleans. They've, had the Hornets/Pelicans now for 20 years, but growing up, New Orleans was one of those single team cities, and they just loved their Saints with everything that they had. And so it's just, I hear the word Superdome and I think of the gold helmets with the little
the fleur-de-lis, yeah.
Blue de Fleur, or whatever it is. I'm an ugly American. And so that's what I think of. I think of a unique team in a unique city that for the longest time was the only show in town for the as far as professional sports are concerned.
Yeah, I mean, for someone who grew up in South Louisiana, as I did, the Superdome has a lot of different meanings for me, which I will get into I think part 3 in this episode that I'm doing, because it's a 3-part series. First of all, let me explain what I'm doing. Before I do that, Jeremy, when you think of the Superdome, or when somebody mentions the Superdome, what do you think of? And then, as I see right now, we're recording this on Zoom. Jeremy's holding up some Mardi Gras beads with a Saints logo on it.
So let me tell you.
So he's coming in already festive.
Let me tell you, I did not earn those Mardi Gras beads. I bought them.
Okay.
I've been to New Orleans a couple times. Great city, beautiful city. It smells funny in some places, but it smells great in others. And I went to the voodoo or hoodoo places and got to experience the beignets at Cafe Du Monde. Oh, my goodness gracious. I inhaled those until I coughed. They were so good. The last time I went, Dana, I went to the Superdome. I've only been to 2 stadiums, one Nissan Stadium, which is a house of sadness. And then I went to that game. And you walk in, and I started recognizing places. Hurricane Katrina.
Yeah.
Hurricane Katrina. I walked through an aisleway that was videotaped. People were videotaping the stuff. And I realized that the place I went to was a place of sorrow for people, legitimate sorrow. It was very, very dark in there. They keep it very dark, but it's awesome. It's an experience. I want to do it again.
One thing I tell people all the time about Hurricane Katrina is that no matter how much you try to explain it, you can never over-exaggerate how bad it was. And to see the Superdome being reborn on that Monday night against the Falcons, it was, as someone who is not a Saints fan but grew up in the South Louisiana as I did, it was a feeling of it was a feeling that you could never truly experience other than maybe possibly winning a Super Bowl, which the Saints eventually did a few years later. and to the chagrin of of me being the only Charger fan in my family and everybody else pretty much Saints fans. But anyway, that's another story for another day. This is part one of a 3-episode series dealing with the 50th anniversary of the opening of the Superdome, and this is episode 1 about the Super Bowls in New Orleans. Later on, we'll have a Superdome episode for the Final Fours that were held there, which were absolute classics. Almost every single one of them was memorable. And finally, and the third is going to be pro wrestling in the Superdome, which will be aired sometime during the spring. So stay tuned for those. Those are coming up pretty soon. But right now, we're going to get right down to business. Super Bowls in the Superdome. We're going to start off with the very first one, Super Bowl 12 in New Orleans. Super Bowl 12, Dallas versus Denver. And I went back and watched this game a couple days ago. A lot of people think that the Rams Patriots Super Bowl a couple years ago was the worst. I watched this game. That was a hard watch. It was a hard watch. And let's just give it a little synopsis. 27-10, Dallas wins that one on January 15th, 1978. And let's kick things off. Let's talk about the Broncos. That season, they were led by the Orange Crush defense. Who wants to go first?
I remember the Orange Crush, but I came in about 7 years or 8 years after this. And watching that team play the defense that they did, it was surprising to me looking back, watching that. I watched that a few years ago, and I thought, yeah, you're right, it's a hard watch. I was surprised that they were dominated like they were.
Yeah, I mean, the thing about that game, it just seemed like they were, the defense pretty much kept them in the game from being a real blowout.
It's funny. I was born in '82, and so I didn't really become aware of the NFL probably to the late '80s, early '90s, and then started to get into the history. And one of the ways, and we were talking about this a little bit before we started recording, one of the ways I got into it was by watching every January, ESPN would rerun these half-hour Super Bowl specials, every one from Super Bowl I all the way till the end. And it's funny, actually, because my wife, Allison, and I have, over the last couple of years, actually been, we've gone through and been watching them before bed, to get ready for the Super Bowl every year. And so one of the ways you learn, and so sort of before the internet and before there was a lot of, NFL Network and all those things out there, you would just kind of watch these highlights and you wouldn't necessarily know what was coming next. And so much of the 70s was Raiders, Steelers, Vikings, Cowboys, and then all of a sudden you get this Broncos team that really was kind of a one-year wonder. And you talk about the Orange Crush defense. Up until this past year, there was not a single player from that defense in the Hall of Fame. And then Randy Gradishar, who was sort of I always kind of feel like he and Jerry Kramer were kind of in the same boat. They were like the two guys who had been waiting forever, being considered by the
Right.
Veterans Committee to get into the Hall of Fame. And Gradishar just got in I think, he was inducted this past summer. And so I always knew less about those teams and that Orange Crush defense other than the name because – first of all, they lost and they got smacked by Dallas in the Super Bowl pretty good, but also there were no legends. And if you think about all those other teams I mentioned, the Dallases, the Pittsburghs, the Oaklands, the Vikings, numerous Hall of Famers on defense alone. And so I, to this day, don't know as much about this Bronco defense as I do most of those other teams from the 70s. And I think a big part of that is because of the lack of Hall of Fame recognition that any of their guys have gotten. And that's not even to say they deserve it, but I'm just, they're a hard team to remember if you didn't live through it.
Well, I was I remember my first Super Bowl I remember is actually a Super Bowl that we're going to talk about pretty shortly, which is Super Bowl 15. But I remember hearing stories about the Orange Crush because I had an uncle who lived in Colorado right around the time of Bronco Mania, and he said it was absolutely insane. But this Broncos team, you had Randy Gradishar, who you mentioned earlier, and also you had Tom Jackson, who everybody knows from NFL Primetime. And leading up to this Super Bowl, believe it or not, in their very first playoff game against the Steelers, he forced 3 turnovers. Tom Jackson did as a rookie, forced 3 turnovers, which led directly to 17 points for the Broncos, and they upset the Steelers, and they beat the last 2 Super Bowl champions to get to Super Bowl 12, and waiting for them were the Dallas Cowboys, who that year went 12-2. And not only that, that was the most wins by a Tom Landry coached team ever. Was 12 wins.
Really?
And that was, and that team was a 6-point favorite, which I was surprising it was that low, 6 points. But it was mostly because of Denver's defense that I think was the reason why.
Well, and I think that one of the things that's worth noting is that, and maybe you were going to get to this, I don't want to jump the gun, but this is Landry going against the guy who had been his quarterback
Exactly.
in his first ever Super Bowl start in Super Bowl 5 in Craig Morton.
Yeah, and that was the big story heading into the Super Bowl was like Staubach versus Morton. You had Craig Morton, who was the starting quarterback of the Cowboys in Super Bowl 5, going up against his quote unquote understudy from the late 60s. And but this Super Bowl had a lot of firsts with it not even being doing the research. I found this very interesting. This is the first Super Bowl in the Dome, obviously. First Super Bowl in the Dome Stadium. Also, this was the first Super Bowl played in prime time.
Really?
Every other Super Bowl before then was played pretty much in the afternoon. This one was the very first Super Bowl played in prime time. And this was also the first Super Bowl that featured 2 teams that had played each other during the regular season that year. That had never happened before. And also, and we can get into this a little bit, Dallas had forced 8 turnovers in this game.
Yeah. That blows my mind that you would have that many turnovers in a Super Bowl, much less a game. 8 turnovers. Let's see, pull it up here in a second. That's just insane.
Yeah.
You can't win a game if you turn over 2 times, much less 8.
There's got to be some kind of record there. I mean, I think it is a Super Bowl record.
I think, Dana, ironically, I think actually that might be tied. Well, I think there's a couple ones. I think Dallas and Buffalo, the first Dallas-Buffalo Super Bowl, Buffalo turned it over a bunch of times. And then the Colt Cowboys Super Bowl.
Super Bowl 5, yeah.
That was the
that
one
was
Craig
awful.
Morton started. Landry's first at the Cowboys lost on a last-second field goal. That had, I think, one of the teams, might have even been Baltimore, one of the teams had 8 turnovers in that one. So I think 8 might be the highest ever, but I don't think that the Broncos in this game have sole ownership of that record, shall we say.
And then Morton goes into the game. He struggles mightily in this game. He's replaced by Norris Weiss from Ole Miss. And ironically enough, from the New Orleans area. Norris Weiss, the backup quarterback, went to Ole Miss, but he's actually grew up in a suburb of New Orleans called Chalmette, which I did not know. I've heard of Norris Weiss. I remember seeing him and doing the highlight of Super Bowl 12, but as far as like knowing where he went to school, I had no idea that he went to Ole Miss right there, and then from Chalmette. But that's pretty interesting. But Dallas wins their second Super Bowl. Like I said, it was Denver's first Super Bowl appearance. First playoff appearance, first Super Bowl appearance, and they returned to the Superdome once again a few years later, as we all know. Hall of Famers in this game: Drew Pearson, Roger Staubach, Tony Dorsett, Randy White and Cliff Harris, and the aforementioned Randy Gradishar as the Hall of Fame linebacker from the Broncos. And again, watching another thing about this game that I found interesting. If you've never seen it, you need to see this. And if you just watch the first half, you know what I'm talking about. Even the first quarter, you'll understand what I'm talking about. They would never be able to get away with what they did production-wise today. Because it seemed like every other play during this Super Bowl, every other play they showed a shot of the cheerleaders. Like literally every other play. You know, and Tom Brookshire in the booth making little snide comments about what he's seeing on the screen. I don't think he would get away with that today, I don't think.
It would not surprise me if Tom and Pat, 'cause I'm assuming Pat Summerall was
It was
partner
Pat
for that
Summerall and
game.
Tom Brookshire.
They might have been tipping a few back at some point.
Well, it was those two plus it's New Orleans, so
It is New Orleans. It is New Orleans. There's not much you can do about that.
One of the other things that's interesting about that Super Bowl, I just should do because I put in a little brief plug for my podcast. Just this past year, a guy by the name of Golden Richards, who's a receiver for the Cowboys, passed away, and our Sports History Network colleague Mark Mortier came on to talk about Golden Richards, and Golden Richards scores on a halfback option pass from running back by the name of Robert Newhouse, and you've seen the highlight, even if you don't know what it is, because it's like Newhouse kind of takes, I think it's a pitch out, and he just stops and he just completely squares up, and he's got the sort of thicker running back shoulder pads, and he kind of just awkwardly bent elbow arcs it down to Golden Richards. But that was Tom Landry, you know, trick plays, complex offense, even in the Super Bowl. And I'm sure there have been other scores on running back option passes in the Super Bowl, but that may well have been the first.
Yeah, I remember one in Super Bowl 14 when I think it was Lawrence McCutcheon for the Rams threw a pass to, I forgot who, I think it was Drew Hill for the Rams who caught it for a touchdown during that game. But that was the first one, for sure. Another thing about that game, another play from that game that I see in my mind's eye that would not be a touchdown today, and that's that Drew Pearson diving catch in the end zone. Every time I see that, I'm like, dude, he didn't catch it. He didn't catch it. You see him catch the ball and land on the ground, and the ball just stays at the goal line, but they called it a touchdown. And I'm like, that would never fly today. In fact, I showed that play a couple years ago to my son Landon, and he's like, they ruled that a touchdown? Why? He dropped it. But it just shows the way it was back then. And
I'm watching that video of the Newhouse touchdown. He is built like Herschel Walker.
He was a big guy.
And the fact that he threw it, Dana, it is a beautiful pass. I mean, I know y'all seen it. Mm-hmm. It is a beautiful pass.
Absolutely. It is. Yeah, it is. And like I said, you often see a guy with that body type throwing a whatever it is 25-yard pass.
And he did it falling backwards.
Yeah, it looked like he was falling backwards. You're right. Yeah.
Of course, if you're that big with that much stuff on the top, any type of back, you're going to go back.
You're going to fall backwards, exactly.
This is also the only Super Bowl where you had co-MVPs. Something else that you probably wouldn't see today. And both of them were on the defense. Harvey Martin and Randy White were both named co-MVPs, the only time in Super Bowl history we have ever done that. And if you never, the two early Super Bowls for Dallas, the MVPs were weird because in Super Bowl V, Chuck Howley was MVP and his team lost, and the Cowboys lost that game. So that's the only time you ever see a losing team from a losing player become MVP. And also in this one, you have co-MVPs. And you had to give it to somebody on the defense because the Dallas offense, looking back at this game, really didn't have to do much because they was constantly operating from a short side of the field.
The fact they only scored 27 points tells you something as well.
Yeah. I mean, they had the short side. They were on the short side of the field for a lot of time, during that game. And it just seemed like every time Craig Morton dropped back to pass, he just was either intercepted or sacked.
What was it? He only had just what, 68 yards? I'm not certain. I might be off on
I
that.
think that's between both quarterbacks.
Between him and the backup, yeah.
Oh, no
between
kidding.
him and Norris Weese, they only had 68 yards passing.
Good gosh.
Like I said, this was a hard watch.
I watched the what you were talking about then is about the ESPN 30-minute type thing. So
Yeah.
you don't really get the full, but I believe I watched the America's Game version of this, which is
Yeah.
about an hour long, and they don't focus so much on that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, they focus really on that. They really focus like on the season.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, those American games are incredible. Every single one of them is great.
They are. They are.
Did you ever watch the ones? And I know it's way off the subject, Dan. I'm sorry. You ever watch the
Good.
ones where like lost rings or they didn't?
Missing rings.
Missing rings,
it's-
yeah.
Oh,
The
wow.
Chargers, the Vikings, the two of the Vikings teams, the Bills team, you know. In fact, I have a DVD copy of the missing rings of the 81 Chargers.
Do you watch that and cry like I do with 2000 Titans 1 yard short? I cry a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. The Freezer Bowl, yeah, I still hurt from that.
Yeah. It popped up on my feed 25 years ago today. This happened. I'm like, no.
I know. I noticed. I saw that today.
I don't need that.
I think that some of the guys who played in the Freezer Bowl probably still get some pain from that too, of a different kind of a.
Well, Kellen Winslow still says that he still can't feel parts of his big toe.
Yeah, no, I know that the same thing with the ice ball. I know there were guys like who 30 years later were like, yeah, I still I hate to be cold in a way I never was before because of that day. So
now moving on, the Cowboys win that first Super Bowl in the Superdome 27-10, their second Super Bowl championship under Coach Landry. Few years later, we have another Super Bowl back in New Orleans. And this one is very personal for me because this is the first Super Bowl I actually remember watching as a kid. Super Bowl 15, January 25th, 1981. Before the game started, this is one of those rare occasions where world events overshadow the game itself.
Yeah.
I know y'all know what I'm talking about.
The hostages, yeah.
The 5 days earlier, the Iran hostage crisis, where 52 Americans were held hostage in Iran for 444 days. And I remember hearing about that as a kid, like constantly every day on the evening news. And 5 days before the Super Bowl, they were released. And heading into the game, there's this big yellow ribbon tied around the Superdome, and all of the cheerleaders and every fans had yellow ribbons, and all of the players had yellow patches on their helmets. And it was their way to commemorate the release of the hostages. And that's one of those rare situations where you have a national or worldwide event that not overshadows the game, but the fans of the game recognize what was going on in the world at the time.
It's amazing, Dana, that you bring this up. I didn't put that together, but I remember it, the ribbon and everything. It's amazing how New Orleans is focused on two big events. You'll get to the other one in a little bit. Well, three, really.
Yeah.
With this one and then a couple more. And that the Super Bowl focuses on that's actually pretty cool. I'm glad you brought that up.
Yeah. And the one thing about New Orleans, they know how to throw a party, but they also are very, very cognizant of what's going on in the world, too.
yeah, this was one that to me, and this was, played almost 2 full years before I was born. But this was always an interesting one for me growing up because my dad was from Philly and he was an Eagles fan. And so this was always known, in my house, by me as, oh yeah, that one time the Eagles made the Super Bowl all those years ago. And very kind of in a lot of ways, well, I was going to say a similar score to the last one we did, but
It's the exact same score.
Not a similar score, the exact same score of.
But it was a
20
very different game.
Very different game, but yeah, it's sort of just. I know that the Eagles. The thing I remember the most about just like sort of highlights of this game and that type of thing is that the Eagles scored a touchdown in the first half that would have kept them in the game more because they're down 14-3 at half, and Harold Carmichael had jumped off sides, and so. Yeah, this is a game. Philly's never really in it. I mean, they're never. Yeah, I mean it's the closest they get is 24-10 at the beginning of the fourth quarter.
Yep.
The outcome of this one doesn't seem to ever really be in doubt.
Well, I'm in a similar situation with you, Dan, because my dad's a Raider fan,
Mm-hmm.
and he and I remember him during that game just absolutely losing his mind every single time the Raiders did something good. My dad's second favorite Raiders player is Jim Plunkett.
Uh-huh.
To this day, I mean, his number one overall top favorite player for the Raiders is Jack Tatum. Go figure. Anyway, but yeah, his second favorite player is Jim Plunkett because of his story. And he had one of the he was named NFL Comeback Player of the Year that year, 1981, after having, number one overall pick by the Patriots, and played well with the Patriots for the first couple of years, and then kind of like fell on hard times, and then went to San Francisco and, struggled there, and then went to the Raiders just basically be a backup. The Eagles, on the other hand, they had finally got through Dallas, finally to get to the Super Bowl. And one of the interesting things about the playoffs in 1980, before they dethroned my Chargers, but in the wild card playoffs, Oakland plays Houston.
Mm-hmm.
Quarterback for Houston was Ken Stabler.
That's right.
So that was very interesting that the Raiders would play Ken Stabler in the playoffs in Oakland as a member of the Oilers, because earlier that year, this is something that you never see either, is that two starting quarterbacks are traded for each other. Because earlier that year, the Raiders had acquired Dan Pastorini from the Oilers, but he broke his leg midway in week 4. He broke his leg and was out for the season, and in comes Jim Plunkett, and the rest, as they say, is history.
And Plunkett had briefly been Stabler's backup a couple years before. And this is just an interesting story that I just found out about recently. In 78, the Buccaneers, their ostensible starter is Doug Williams.
Yeah.
But the coach of the Bucs, McKay, he feels like either he needs a backup for Doug Williams, or maybe this was even when Doug Williams had started to get banged up. And so he trades with the Raiders for a guy who'd been his quarterback at USC, a guy named Ray. The guy's last name was Rae Ray. I don't remember.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about. Yeah. I can't think of his first name, but I know what you're talking about.
And so with that trade, the Raiders need a backup. So they go out and get Jim Plunkett off the scrap heap. And he ends up being comeback player of the year, winning 2 Super Bowls, Super Bowl MVP, all that stuff. So if the coach of the Bucs had not been obsessed with his own USC players a couple of years before, Jim Plunkett might have never been on the Raiders and won 2 Super Bowls.
He should have stuck with that Pac-12 connection and went with Plunkett, because Plunkett went to Stanford. So
that's right. Exactly.
The Raiders win this game 27-10. The Eagles actually were favored in this game. They were 3-point favorites over the Oakland Raiders. They were coached by Tom Flores, first Hispanic American coach to win a Super Bowl. This was the Eagles' very first Super Bowl, led by Ron Jaworski and Wilbert Montgomery. And one of the earliest plays I remember in my life was that NFC Championship game where Wilbert Montgomery broke that run against the Cowboys. And I will never forget that, because my mom was a Cowboys fan before she transitioned from the Saints. When Tom Landry left, she became a Saints fan. And I remember that. And one thing about that, and I think you and your brother had mentioned this when y'all did your episode on the greatest championship games.
Oh yeah, the conference championship games. Yep.
Yeah. That game was the last time the Cowboys had wore those blue jerseys with the white numerals.
Oh, interesting. I
think y'all might have mentioned that. I heard that somewhere.
We probably did. Yeah, that sounds like something Andrew would pull out. Yeah, definitely.
It was that was the last time, because from that point forward, whenever they wore those blue jerseys, they had silver numbers. Those are the uniforms that they wore back in Super Bowl V. And that was the last time that's the last time they made that an appearance in an NFL game.
Interesting.
Yeah, Jim Plunkett in that game was named MVP, 16 to 21 for 261 yards and 3 touchdowns. And the key play in that game was the 80-yard pass to Kenny King, which he ran down the far sideline, out jumped Herman Edwards for the 80-yard touchdown. That game, like, of all the Super Bowl highlight films, that's like one of my favorites.
Mm-hmm.
Even though I don't care for the Raiders, I just like it for some reason. I don't know. It's just something about it I just like, or maybe it's the fact that it was the first Super Bowl I remember watching.
Yeah.
NFL Network or the NFL Films did a good job of displaying that on the, they would do the voiceover and they'll do that. And I think it was looking down from the ceiling of the Superdome. It's kind of like a hazy 70s, 80s type video. That's one of my favorite I remember about that. That Super Bowl, if I remember correctly, started Dick Vermeil toward kind of a burnout.
Yeah.
It did, yeah.
Now, to me, he redeemed himself later on against my Titans, and I hate that. I hate that redemption story, but that started his burnout, and that guy's a good coach.
One other thing that I would mention here, and again, I'm not looking to just continue to bring up my podcast, but Andrew and I did an episode a couple years ago about the 1980 in Philadelphia sports, because this is the only year, and when you say 1980 for the winter sports, you mean 79-80, and for NFL, you mean 80 into 81.
Yeah.
But this was a year when all 4 major Philly sports teams made it to the championship of their respective sports, and it actually ended here with the Eagles losing to the Raiders. The Sixers lost to rookie Magic Johnson in the finals. Magic fills in for Kareem. The Flyers lost to the Islanders in the Stanley Cup. I believe that was the first of the Islanders' 4 championships. Don't quote me on that. And then the Phillies won their first World Series in franchise history. So that's something else really interesting about this Super Bowl, is that it is the capstone to maybe the greatest single year in Philadelphia sports history.
Another interesting fact about this Super Bowl here was the fact that Jim Plunkett was named MVP, but should he have been instead of Rod Martin?
Rod Martin had 3 interceptions, right?
Yes, Rod Martin had 3 interceptions in this game. And can you imagine if this game was played today? The type of controversy that would be following this game? Because, it's sport, like Sports Talk Radio got to find something to talk about, something to complain about after every Super Bowl. This would be front and center. Should Rod Martin have been named MVP? With 3 interceptions, Super Bowl record, 3 interceptions. He had a great story, too, because he was cut by the Raiders earlier that year and was brought back because of injuries. And Rod Martin comes in and gets the 3 interceptions. The first one is like the 3rd play of the game, to set up the Raiders early on. And you may mention earlier about Harold Carmichael with that, I think it was a illegal motion penalty that they called him on, and he's one of the guys that was in the Hall of Fame from this game, and I just have to give him a shout out because he is a fellow graduate of Southern University, like I am. So
there you go. The only point I would make about Martin, because I think this has happened in Super Bowls once or twice before. The 3rd interception was very late in the game, and you have to wonder whether maybe the voting had already wrapped up, and most of the guys had voted already, because that's happened before. I think in the Tampa Bay Super Bowl against the Raiders, there was a guy with 2 interceptions, 1 for a touchdown, and
Dexter Jackson.
Was it Dexter Jackson? Jackson got it, but I think Brooks had 2 picks, and one of them was for a touch. And I don't remember the specifics, but it was the same type of thing. It was like you realize, like, okay, like anything that happened after about 6 minutes in the 4th quarter, they weren't aware of when they were voting. So my guess is if Rod Martin had already had the 3 interceptions when the guys were voting, he probably would have won it. Just a guess.
Yeah, Harold Carmichael is the only Philadelphia Eagle that's in the Hall of Fame. The other Hall of Famers for the Raiders, Cliff Branch, Art Shell, Gene Upshaw, and the Mad Stark himself, Ted Hendricks. They're in the Hall of Fame.
Wasn't there another Eagle? Who was the guy? Was it Humphrey? Wasn't he a Hall of Famer?
Yeah, Claude Humphrey, yeah.
Claude Humphrey, yeah, the old Falcon.
Yeah, Claude Humphrey. I forgot to write that down. Yeah.
All good. That's why you got us here.
Yes, right. Hey, only the best. Iron sharpens iron.
I'm used to correcting Andrew and having him correct me, so this is how I do it.
We've had 2 Super Bowls in New Orleans to this point. Super Bowl 12 was 27-10. Cowboys over the Broncos. This one here, Super Bowl 15, Raiders over the Eagles 27-10. If you ever started to notice a theme here that the losing team is having 10 points, well, the next one is the same thing. The losing team got 10 points. However, you talk about Super Bowls that were hard watches. The next one definitely was. Super Bowl 20, January 26, 1986. Bears 46, Patriots 10. Bears came into this game as 10-point favorites.
Now, wait, you're talking about hard watch, or you talking about the game or the Super Bowl shuffle? Both of them were pretty tough.
Actually.
Both of them were pretty bad, Dana. Oh. Anyway, sorry about that. I just had to.
Hey, look, I love the comedy. I love it. It was the Bears' first Super Bowl win, their first NFL championship since 1963. It was the first Super Bowl to feature 2 teams making their first Super Bowl appearance at the same time. Richard Dent was named MVP, and the Bears had 7 sacks in this game and held the Patriots to only 7 yards rushing. If
Tennessee
that's not
State.
Domination, I don't know what is.
Tennessee State alum, like my mom, my sister, and my dad are both from graduated Tennessee State. So there's that connection. Richard Dent.
Yes.
He still looked at that way in Tennessee.
The other thing that's interesting about this Super Bowl, I actually just kind of just dawned on me. I think this is the only Super Bowl where both coaches are Hall of Fame players.
Hall of Fame,
Players, yeah.
Ditka and Raymond Berry.
Yeah, and this game was another hard watch. Go ahead, Jay.
No, I mean, if you think about it, both of them played very similar styles and very similar positions. Ditka tight end, Berry wide receiver. But both of them played in the same era, so their teams would reflect that. The only problem is Ditka had a team that reflected a lot more than Berry did. Tough.
Yeah.
Well, one thing about the Patriots, and I think I'm really leaning on doing a episode about that 85 Patriot team, because except the Super Bowl needs to be pushed aside a little bit. Their run to the Super Bowl was incredible if you really think about it. They knock off the Jets in the first round. They beat the Jets 26-14 in the Meadowlands. All 3 of their playoff games were on the road. They beat the Jets 26-14. That Ken O'Brien, Wesley Walker, Freeman McNeil, high-powered offense, Jets team of the mid-'80s. Then they go to L.A., they knock off the Raiders 27-20, which my dad is still furious about. I brought it up to him earlier today, and he's still miffed about that game. He said, we still haven't figured out a way to stop Craig James. Then in the AFC Championship game, not only did they have to overcome the Dolphins, but they had to overcome something called the Orange Bowl jinx. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I do not.
It sounds like a bad drink.
Well, the Orange Bowl jinx was this. The Patriots had lost 18 consecutive games to the Dolphins in the Orange Bowl.
Whoa.
They had not beaten the Dolphins in the Orange Bowl since their inaugural season of 1966.
Wow.
and they go into the Orange Bowl and they not only beat the Dolphins but basically run away with it 31-14. And it's mostly because of their defensive secondary. You know, they had both teams were basically defensive oriented, but in different ways. The Bears was just physical, just a physical outfit as we saw in the Super Bowl, but when it came down to the Patriots, they were more of a ball hawking, forced turnovers type of team. And you kind of saw that in the first 5 minutes of the game. The Patriots had got to the Super Bowl by takeaways. I think they had something like 20-some takeaways during the playoffs or something like that. It was some outrageous number that they had in all three of their playoff games. They go in the Super Bowl, third play of the game, Walter Payton fumbles. And they're like in plus territory. But you knew it was that kind of day on their first offensive play when Eason throws it to their tight end, Lynn Dawson, not the ex-Chiefs quarterback, but Lynn Dawson, Lin Dawson. And trying to catch the ball, he tears his ACL. Yeah. He led the team. He was like the second leading receiver on the team that year and tears his ACL, non-contact, falling out of bounds. And Tony Franklin kicks the field goal to give him a 3-0 lead. As an aside, Tony Franklin, first kicker in Super Bowl history to be a barefoot kicker, something that you don't see in the NFL no more.
Nope. Wow. I did not know
how
that.
you give football's athlete's foot. I don't think so.
I was like in junior high when this game took place, and me being adventurous, I tried kicking soccer style with barefoot.
How'd that work?
It didn't work. It didn't work.
Yeah.
I tried, but it did not work. But Bears dominated that game.
You know, go ahead, Jeremy.
No, let me ask you a question, because obviously this was in 85, 86 in that time frame. Would the Bears, if they had that same lineup, same skills, all that, would that carry over to modern day NFL?
That's a good question. I think the scheme that they ran back then was so exotic that no one had seen it before, but enough time has passed where I think that coaches have figured out how to solve it. But the one thing is that I remember hearing all the time is that, the old saying in football, it's not about the X's and the O's, it's about the Jimmies and the Joes. I think that they had the perfect Buddy Ryan put together, perfect defensive philosophy with the types of players that he had.
Right.
The Mike Singletaries, the Wilbert Marshalls, the Dave Durisons, that bunch.
Isn't this the only Super Bowl I can remember that both there was two coaches carried off the field?
Yeah.
So do you give the because in Chicago, if I were to say this, I'd be run out, because you know who would win between the fight between Godzilla and Dicka? Dicka. But is this a product of Mike Dick, or is this a product of Ryan?
That has been a topic of debate in Chicago for years.
Here's the one thing I've always said about that, and people don't realize this, and I'm a Giant fan, and, obviously the following year here was 86, and it was the Giants, and the Giants beat the 49ers in the NFC, in the divisional round, and then they beat Washington 17-0 in the conference championship game before they went to the Super Bowl. And the Giants were 14-2 that year. They were the number one seed in all of the NFC. What you don't realize is that the Bears actually were also 14-2 that year. They were the 2 seed, and the Redskins upset them in the second round. My point being is that you got to give Buddy Ryan some credit, but I think maybe he should get more credit on sort of the architecture side of it rather than sort of how they did, because the Bears were a consistent playoff team for most of the rest of the Ditka years up until the early 90s. Yeah. And Buddy Ryan was long gone to Philadelphia by then. So, yeah, maybe you give Buddy Ryan credit for laying the groundwork. Yeah. But you can't discount the fact that it's not as if he went away and then suddenly they were terrible. They were only one loss worse a year after that, and then they were in the playoffs in '88. That was the famous Fog Bowl year against. Was that against Philly?
That was against Philly.
That
Yeah.
was
That was
against Philly,
against
yeah.
Buddy Ryan in Philly. So you got to give Ditka and the players credit for keeping it going for many years after Buddy Ryan had walked out the
That Fog
door.
Bowl, by the way, way off the subject, kept one of the best teams I've ever seen out of the Super Bowl. Randall Cunningham and that Kelly Green jersey, they should have been in the Super Bowl that year. They were such an amazing team to watch.
I mean, and then you had that defensive line with Reggie White and Jerome Brown, and the defense was just outstanding for the Eagles team. But yeah, you're right. I mean, I think that Buddy Ryan should be considered like the architect, the pretty much the designer of that defense.
Before
Give him
six,
credit
yeah.
for that.
Before 6.
And the guys loved him.
Yeah.
In the 30 for 30 about the '85 Bears,
That was
one
hilarious.
of the things that they show is all those guys, Dent and Singletary and Hampton, all going back to visit Buddy Ryan during the final years of his life. So, and who is it? I think it was actually the night before the Super Bowl when basically everybody knew he was going to leave. And as they're having their defensive meeting, as the meeting's wrapping up, Steve McMichael goes up and rips the blackboard off the wall or something like that because they're all just so angry at the fact that they're losing Buddy Ryan. So the guys loved him, even if he and Ditka didn't love each other necessarily.
It wasn't hilarious about him leaving. What I thought was funny was how the lead up to the games where they would try to speak over the offense during their plannings, and that to me is hilarious. It shows you who Buddy Ryan was to them.
That Bears offense was, other than Peyton, which I'm still kind of miffed about because Peyton never scored a touchdown, and they gave it to William Perry, which I'm like, what are you doing? I know he was a cult hero and everything during that time. And, y'all got, during that time, there was no bigger character in the NFL than William Refrigerator Perry.
Literally.
Literally. I see what you did there. I see what you did. Also, the pregame. I think the pregame hype overshadowed the game itself. Especially with the antics of Jim McMahon. He got fined by the NFL for wearing an Adidas, which was not sanctioned by the NFL, an Adidas headband.
And they said, Roselle, don't find me.
Yeah.
It's funny. Of course, it's not funny now what he is going through.
Yeah.
But he broke a lot of norms, not only where he graduated college, but he played for the Bears, and then didn't he play for the Packers and won a Super Bowl with them? He played for the Packers with that Brett Favre one.
Yeah.
I remember that. He is the guy, him and Peyton are the two guys that I remember most from that team, from that particular year. William Perry was part of that, but I don't even think he was the focal point of that defense. But Jim McMahon, didn't he moon?
He mooned a helicopter.
Yeah.
The story behind that was that he had injured his glute in one of the playoff games, I want to say. And he got so tired of people asking him, and then they had a helicopter flying over their practices. So he decided he got tired of this and mooned the helicopter. Then he didn't do this, but it was said by one of the New Orleans sports. He was like our Mad Dog and Buddy DiBedetto. I could never say his name, but Buddy D was a sports talk show host at WDSU in New Orleans, and he had basically accused Jim McMahon of calling the women of New Orleans sluts. Mm-hmm. And there was a big blow up over that. And come to find out it wasn't true. Buddy made it up because he hated the Bears. And he was like, the Bears are coming in here and they're going to wreck our city and blah, 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 blah. And he was forced to make a retraction of that like right before the Super Bowl. But it caused a big stir in New Orleans leading up to that game.
Can I?
They also had the greatest halftime performance ever during a Super Bowl. Have you
Who
seen
was
that
this?
one?
Who did the halftime that year?
Up with people,
Oh.
and I'm saying that so mockingly. It was awful. It was awful. It's kind of like the adult version. I respect this, by the way, the Small World and Disney World, but it's
Yeah.
kind of like the adult version there at the Super Bowl of this. It's a Small World. It was terrible.
I just before we move on, I want to tell one Patriot story that I think I've probably mentioned before on my podcast and maybe even guesting other places. The Patriots quarterback is Tony Eason, and they're probably their best player, and maybe one of the best players in Patriots history is a guard named John Hanna.
Yeah.
And apparently, I heard the story that at one point, after a couple series of Tony Eason just playing horribly, not completing a pass, taking sacks, interceptions, John Hanna goes back to the sidelines and said to the coaches, "You can leave that guy in if you want, but I'm not blocking for him." So,
Wow.
yeah,
Didn't they bring in Steve Grogan later on?
they
They
brought in
did.
Steve Grogan, yeah, and he did better, but
Not
not
as
much.
good. Steve Rogan is the only quarterback that I've ever seen that wear a neck roll.
Well, he has my problem. We have weak necks, and you gotta be careful about that.
Yeah, I wore a neck roll one year in playing high school football, but I was a linebacker. So
Yeah.
so we've had 3 Super Bowls in New Orleans. 3 of them have been the first 2, kind of blowouts. This one was a blowout for sure. The next one, a real blowout.
I don't want to talk about this one. Can we move to the next one? Is that okay?
Jeremy, look, I get it. I get it. My
No,
Chargers
no.
were blown out by the 49ers too, so
No.
don't feel bad.
Dana, this it hurts me to the core.
January 28th, 1990. San
You're gonna do it.
Francisco. Yes.
You're gonna do it.
San Francisco 55, Denver 10. San Francisco came into the game as 12-point favorites. Joe Montana was the MVP, 20 of 29 for 297 yards. I thought he threw more than that. 297 yards, but he threw 5 touchdowns.
Yeah, he did. Every bit of that.
Now, I wrote some things down like leading into the game. One of the things that I wrote down was this that I found very interesting. There were several cities that were in the running to host this Super Bowl. And these cities are like, a couple of them were like, well, you can see that. But then there's a few here you're like, I could never see a Super Bowl there.
I think I've heard about this. Was one of them Philly?
Yes.
Yeah.
The cities were Philadelphia, Anaheim, Detroit, which was already had the Super Bowl there already, Houston, the Astrodome, which I'm surprised they never hosted one, Jacksonville. This was before the Jaguars came into the league. San Francisco and I couldn't see a Super Bowl at Candlestick. And Seattle in the Kingdome. And I'm like, just thinking about this is like, I can never imagine a Super Bowl in Philly. I'm sorry. I know I've never been to Philadelphia. I'm more than sure it's a wonderful city. Their fans are insane, but I think it's a beautiful city. I've never been there, but I can't imagine a Super Bowl of all places in the Vet. Can you imagine that though?
We're praying for the city definitely because of what they're going through. But it's kind of like this: the Vet. I've never been to Philly, but I know people who are. They said it was a dump. And what was the quote from somebody? It's a dump, and we love it.
Yeah.
So would you want? Listen to this, Dana. I've just this is on Wikipedia, so you'll have to triple and quadruple check it. But they said at this point, the cost of a 30-second commercial was $700,000. $700,000 started to inch up. Do you think location plays a part in that?
I think so.
If you have a Super Bowl worth watching, like aesthetics.
Yeah.
So that I
It's
had a
interesting.
problem. I had a problem with them hosting it up in Rutherford, up in
East
the
Rutherford?
Yeah.
I mean,
because
it was a brand new stadium. It was New York City. Well, New Jersey, but it was Metro New York. I I didn't have a problem with it. The only thing is that I was hoping that it would be cold there,
Yeah,
because it would get New Orleans off the hook. Because believe it or not, Super Bowl six is still the coldest Super Bowl
In Tulane.
at Tulane Stadium. Super Bowl six was still the coldest Super Bowl, and Super Bowl nine is the third coldest, which was the
yeah.
last game played at Tulane Stadium.
They lucked out there with the New York one because I think game time temperature was like in the 40s, and then a cold front came in like 4 o'clock in the morning. Like if they'd played it a day later,
Hmm.
it probably would have broken the record. Here's the thing that I want to say about the cold weather cities in the Super Bowl. They had the one in New York, but I gotta say, like, if you're gonna have it in other cold weather cities that just happen to have domes, Detroit, Indy, Minneapolis, if you're gonna have it in those cities, there's really no reason not to have it in cold weather cities with outdoor stadiums because it's just the 3 or 4 hours for the game that's
Yeah,
different. The
yeah.
whole rest of the week,
You're indoors anyway.
everything else you're doing is outside or
Right.
is not outside. Like it's not like you're walking down the street in Detroit or Chicago in early February and it's warm. So it really is just about those few hours sitting there watching the game. Plus, the NFL now, with all their schedule changes, plays conference championship games in Green Bay and Baltimore and Kansas
Philly.
City and Philly and Cincinnati and all these places at 7 o'clock, Buffalo, seven
Right.
o'clock at Pittsburgh, 7 o'clock at night in the middle of January. So to me, it's like to let Detroit and Indy and those cities host a Super Bowl, but to keep New York and Philly and Boston and those cities, Chicago and those cities out of it. That
Right.
I don't know, that doesn't seem ideologically consistent to
Now I
me.
get what you're saying, but the idea of Philly at that time
Philly at that time, yeah,
was
absolutely.
terrible.
Yeah.
The fact is, the cookie cutter stadiums, the Pittsburgh, all those things, they were not good stadiums. And right now, the Superdome is probably one of the better stadiums in the NFL.
Oh yeah.
Still is. So
Especially with all of the renovations that they've done to it since Katrina.
yeah,
Well, not only since Katrina, but they've had some extensive renovations in the last couple of years, you know, to make it like first class. I mean, I've had a couple of friends of mine who went to the Dome for a Saints game this past year, and they said that the way the Dome was post Katrina and now is like a world of difference. Because they have a lot more of like the corporate feel to it. You have more boxes, you got more like club seating and like more of a club feel to it, and stuff like that, which a lot of
your
those
friends
stadiums are
would
going to
your
now.
friends would probably have more of a reference than I would because, like I said, I've only been there once, and the only time I really had anything to do with with New Orleans is Madden, so I don't know what it's like. So they probably would have a better feel of it than I would.
Um, the Super Bowl 24.
Yep.
The game drew a 39.0 Nielsen rating, which at the time was the lowest Super Bowl television rating since Super Bowl three. And I wonder why that was. The game, quite frankly, was a bad game. Not only for the Broncos, I'll never forget this. I think I was in high school. I was a junior in high school. And I always bring this up because that's the best way for me to remember Super Bowls, like where I was in life. I was a junior in high school. And I'll never forget this. Me and some friends were outside playing basketball. And my sister comes outside. She says, Dana, the Super Bowl's about to start. And I say, okay, fine. We'll be there in a few minutes. So we still playing basketball, whatever. We have to finish this game or whatever that we were playing. We finished the game. We go in the house. It was already 14-0. And we're like, all right, we weren't even gone but 5 minutes. But that's how quick it was. I mean, it was so crazy. It was the 49ers had scored like twice, before we even got in the house. Denver became the second team to lose 4 Super Bowls.
Yeah.
And they have the
And by the way, the one before these four were not anywhere close. The Giants one was the closest one. The Redskins one was a blowout, and this was even worse.
right. Denver had been to the Super Bowl, scored 10 points earlier, their first appearance back when they played the Cowboys. Um, 49ers, of course, had Joe Montana, league MVP, Offensive Player of the Year. In the playoffs, San Francisco avenged their earlier loss to Minnesota, which they lost the year before. Avenged that loss, beat them 41-13, and then in the NFC Championship game, they beat the Rams 30-3. Of all the teams that I've seen grow up while growing up, this '89 49ers team may be these eyes one of the top three best offenses I've ever seen. Because they went through those teams and they made it look so easy, especially in the Super Bowl.
I think this was a time Montana had a lot of injury issues in the mid 80s. He was finally injury free and was really probably playing, like you said, he was MVP year. He was probably playing the best football of his career, this year, the following year. Jerry Rice has really come into his own. Not that they didn't have good offensive weapons in the earlier years, but Jerry Rice is Jerry Rice. So they really are sort of firing on all cylinders here. They've got the momentum and the motivation of wanting to win two in a row after having beaten Cincinnati the year before. And then from a Denver point of view, this is the one of the three Elway Super Bowls, the three '80s Super Bowls. This is the one that they're never really in. The
Right.
Giants Super Bowl is close for the whole first half. In fact, Denver is leading 10-9
At halftime, right.
at halftime. The 22 a year later against the Redskins blow them out by scoring 5 touchdowns in the second quarter, but it's a close game at least through one quarter.
Didn't the Broncos in that game score in their first offensive play?
Yeah,
That
it
sounds
was
right.
fast. It was fast.
Yeah.
I remember. I know it was a pass to Ricky Nattiel for like 70 yards or something like that. But it was like their first offensive play they just scored. And I'm like, oh my god, and it was like, are we gonna have another blowout Super Bowl? But this time, the AFC is gonna win. But this is also, to bring that up, this is like in the middle of the NFC's dominance of the AFC. This is like in the middle of it.
And it stops when the Broncos beat the Packers later on.
But that's like that. But and that's like a decade later, which is
we're not talking about
crazy.
That either. It's good things that we're talking about, Daniel.
Well, you got to remember, I'm an AFC guy too.
Yeah, but you're a Chargers fan, so you're probably happy.
I'm part of that. It's always part of that.
but
you may have had the worst
particular one, it's kind of like the defense has to stop the offense. The offense does not let off of the gas. The defense has to stop them. And you look at the score, the defense couldn't do anything. I remember watching this. This was sad.
But at the same time, nobody against that San Francisco offense, nobody was able to contain them. I mean, they beat the Rams 30-3, and the Rams had beat them earlier that year. If I'm not mistaken, I think they had beaten them earlier that year when they played in Anaheim. And the 49ers come out and then blow them away 30-3. They shut down Jim Everett in that offense with Flipper Anderson and who's the other receiver? Henry Ellard.
Oh my goodness, I love those names. That's awesome. I'm remembering those guys.
The 49ers scored again 461 yards of total offense. And they scored on their first 11 drives.
Yeah. That game, I remember coming home from church and going to my grandmother's house to watch it. And I'm like, this is not supposed to happen this quick.
Yeah.
It was terrible. By the way, just looking at this again, this is Wikipedia. 27-3 at the end of the first half.
Yeah.
It didn't get any better.
And 8 touchdowns, which I don't know. Is this still the record for points in a game, this 55?
Because I think the Cowboys came the closest the first time they played Buffalo, and they scored 53.
What was the Chargers 49ers game, was that 49?
Yeah, 49,
Yeah,
49,
that
20,
was
49.
20, 49, 26.
Yeah. So
Yeah,
this
okay.
is the only Super Bowl where a team has ever scored 8 touchdowns, and Montana is using all of his weapons. I think both starting running backs, both starting receivers, and the tight end all score a touchdown here.
And the tight end Brent Jones, he was
Brent
Brent
Jones,
very
Jones.
yeah.
very
Brent-
underrated. But then you had Rathman,
Mm-hmm.
didn't you? Craig at the time
Roger
was
Craig.
it Craig, and then Taylor and Rice, and
Yep. Yep.
that's awesome. And
Yeah.
if I remember correctly as well, is this the Super Bowl where President Bush says that they're going to make a new TV show called Miami Rice? And the joke when they came, and it was one of the worst jokes I've ever heard in my life. And I've said some terrible ones, and that was terrible. If you've not seen that, if this is the one I'm thinking of, look it up and just cringe. Just cringe.
Well, especially because they weren't even in Miami.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, I'm just telling you, this is straight 80s to 90s humor that was situational. It was terrible.
Anybody want to add something before we move on to the
No,
next one?
let's move on real fast. Let's go.
Now we got the bad Super Bowls out of the way. Now the ones that we're going to get into, the next ones are going to be a little bit more competitive and have a little bit more excitement to them. Super Bowl 31, January 26, 1997. Packers 35, Patriots 21. Packers entered that game as 14-point favorites, mostly because a lot of people thought that the Patriots had one of the easiest routes to the Super Bowl ever. This is the Super Bowl where, and I remember this, and there was like a whole lot of hype that a lot of people wanted the two expansion teams, the Panthers and the Jags, to meet up in the Super
Yeah,
Bowl. And
I
it
remember
came
that.
really, really close. The Jags had upset the Broncos earlier in the playoffs and ended up playing the Patriots in the AFC Championship game. And the Panthers, and I forgot about this. The Panthers were the number 2 seed in the NFC that year. They had beaten the Cowboys in the divisional round to play the Packers in the NFC Championship game at Lambeau, and the Patriots beat the Jaguars 20-6 at Old Foxborough Stadium, which I've always said was basically a glorified high school field, because if you looked at Old Foxborough Stadium, it looked like a high school field. And the Packers beat the Panthers 30-13 at frigid Lambeau. I remember how it was like really cold.
Was that Steve Berline was the quarterback for the Panthers at that time?
Either it was Berline or was it Kerry Collins?
Kerry Collins would come out. He would come out a little bit later on. I think it was Berline.
Might have been Berline.
And the neat part about that, Dana, is there's some redemptive qualities for him in that situation, if he was the one I'm thinking of. So, yeah, golly, that Jacksonville team, way off the subject, was defeated, to me at that time, the best Broncos team I've ever seen.
Yeah, that was a really good Bronco team. They had the number one, that was I think they were the top seed in the AFC that year.
That's exactly right.
They were the top seed in the AFC that year. That was the famous Woody Page called them the Jagwads, heading into that game. That was like an article written by Woody Page from the Denver Post that called the Jacksonville Jaguars the Jagwads. And Brunell and company went up to Mile High and beat them. I remember that game. They could not stop Natrone Means. And I was like, why weren't you doing that when you were in San Diego? Even though he was he was a Pro Bowler the year they went to the Super Bowl, but they could not stop Natrone Means. They could not stop him. But this game here, and this game, I remember, this was like one of the first Super Bowl parties I ever attended. I was in college at the time, and Desmond Howard is MVP of this Super Bowl. 244 return yards, including a 99 kickoff return for a touchdown, right when you thought the Patriots was coming back to take the lead, because they had all the momentum at that point over the Packers.
Yeah, the thing. So I guess a couple things about this one. On the game itself, I sort of first became aware of. I think the first Super Bowl I remember was the Giants and the Bills in 25. And the first one I really remember watching beginning to end was the first Dallas Buffalo Super Bowl.
Mhm.
And so you had Dallas and Buffalo, the 49ers and the Chargers that we talked about. But then even looking back, kind of learning about recent Super Bowls, I learned about the Denver losses to Washington and New York and San Francisco. And that was sort of, in addition to the NFC dominating every year, there was also this narrative that had developed that the Super Bowl was just never a good game. And I remember a little bit the year before in Pittsburgh and Dallas in Super Bowl 30, that game was still competitive in the fourth quarter. But then this game was the first one, like you said, Dana, where you really felt well into the fourth quarter like both teams might, like the team that was trailing, the Patriots, might have the chance to win. It was, it was a two-score game, but it was, like you said, the Patriots were rallying. Did they ever have the lead in this game? They probably did it.
Yeah, they did at the end of the first quarter.
Okay. Yeah, because they scored at the end of they had a 14-10 lead. And then they're driving down 2 scores, but with 8.5 minutes left, and then Bledsoe throws an interception. So it was really kind of the first or maybe the second game in a very long time where it was okay, this is competitive. It's not over by the middle of the third quarter. And then the other thing I really would say that I remember about this one, and maybe this was just because I was in New York, and so it was more the focus, but the whole soap opera of the week before going into the game, where it's basically been established, although nobody can say it out loud, it's basically been established that Bill Parcells is going to leave leave the Patriots, return to New York, go to the Jets, and kind of the distraction that presented for his team. So that's I almost remember that week leading up to it more than I remember the actual game.
The game here, what I remember about this, Dana, I might be off on this. This is really when free agency hit, because the one guy that made a huge difference in this game was picked up off of the Eagles, and look what he did.
Yeah.
Right.
Reggie, yeah. I mean, not only that, Andre Rison came from the Falcons.
Yeah, he did, didn't he?
The Packers.
So, and that's, again, this is where Jim McMahon was. This is when he won his Super Bowl. This game right here tells me also, and the halftime show had the Blues Brothers and James Brown in it. Oh, I remember that.
Yeah, I remember that too. I remember that.
But this right here shows me how good Drew Bledsoe was.
Yeah.
Now, people say, well, he's the one that lost his job to Tom Brady. He was the reason why the
Patriots got there. I mean, Drew Bledsoe over the years have gotten something of a raw deal, I believe, because he was the best Patriots quarterback in the history of the franchise before Brady, and I can remember that when they drafted him, there was so much hope for that franchise when he got there from Washington State, and he delivered. He really delivered for that time. I remember one game they played against the Dolphins. He threw 50 times, which was unheard of in a game. But this Super Bowl right here, if it went for that late interception, who knows what would have happened? Because the Patriots at that time, and up to this point, believe it or not, every Super Bowl that the Patriots had ever been in was in New Orleans. Up to this point. And the next Super Bowl that they will go to will also be in New Orleans, we were talking about in a sec. But this Super Bowl, I mean, it was the most exciting Super Bowl. And that was when you really started to see the Super Bowl going from a game that a lot of people would turn off at halftime because of or just keep watching because of the commercials, and people would keep watching because actually the game is actually good. This is when it kind of started to turn. Okay, because the next year you had the Packers again against the Broncos, and that really wasn't decided until late in the game.
Yeah.
Okay, and then a couple years later, sorry about this, Jeremy, again, the Titans and Rams. Yeah.
You are just rubbing salt in the wounds today. I tell you what. When I'm ignorant on this 'cause I remember watching it, but I don't remember when it happened. Um, did you when did Desmond Howard do his 99-yard run? Was
It
that
was in
early or
either, I think it was like right in the beginning of the fourth quarter it happened.
I can
Either
look that
se-
up.
It was like
yeah.
either right. I think it was the second half, either late in the third or early in the fourth. It happened.
So for him to do this, of course, I'm completely ignorant on it. So for him to do this, it would be an amazing thing for him to turn. Desmond Howard, people say, well, he was a kick returner, he was a punt returner, he was not a receiver. We know that, uh, but he helped win a Super Bowl. And Desmond Howard was not only an amazing college player, but he was also
Hmm.
serviceable in what he needed to do.
Yeah.
It, it's always funny when they go back to when they'll bring together all the Super Bowl MVPs for something because so many of them are Hall of Famers, and let's
Right.
just be honest, so many of them are Hall of Fame quarterbacks,
And then you
and
have
it's always
Desmond Howard.
yeah, you got, and in back-to-back years you got two sort of journeyman guys. You had Larry Brown from the Cowboys the year
Yeah.
before, and then Desmond Howard, and it's like those are probably the two Super Bowl MVPs, and I don't know, maybe I'm missing one, but that
What do
had
you
the least prolific NBA or
Yeah.
NFL careers.
what do those two people have in common? They were signed later on by the Raiders and did nothing.
Yep.
Right.
Uh-huh.
Right. Right.
They were
You
signed
know,
later. Larry Brown, way off the subject. All he had to do was show up with his hands.
Yeah.
That's all he had to do, and he did it.
can I let me just tell a quick Jim McMahon story before we move on. Right after the Bears beat the Patriots in '85 or early '86, they were scheduled to go to the White House, but it was that week. I think it was actually even the next day. The Challenger space shuttle blew up,
Yeah.
and so that was a national tragedy. Don't go to the White House ever. I think Obama actually brought them back like 20 years later as like a
Uh-huh.
Chicago type thing. But 10 years later, McMahon's on the Packers. He's the backup to Favre. They win the Super Bowl. They go to the, I guess it would have been the Clinton White House, and Jim McMahon wears his Bears jersey to the White House with all his Packer teammates because he wanted a bear representative since they never got to go in
Awesome.
Super Bowl
That's
20.
awesome.
But that's typical Jim
That's Jim
McMahon, though,
McMahon,
you
yeah.
would think. That's typical him, and then the Bears of all teams,
Yeah.
you omit all the Packers. Ooh, that's a good look. Anyway, then you get February 3rd, 2002, Super Bowl 36. Right after, not about a few months after, of course, 9/11. Patriots play the Rams. The Rams come in 14-2. They're a 14-point favorite to beat the Patriots. Patriots in their third Super Bowl, their third trip to New Orleans for the Super Bowl. This Super Bowl is played in February, which, by the way, it was originally scheduled for January 27th, but they pushed it back a week because you had that week during the season that they did not play.
They couldn't reschedule was it automobile showcase?
That plus it was also the middle of Mardi Gras.
Mm.
Oh, that's a perfect time to have a bunch of drunk NFL fans down there.
It was also in the middle of Mardi Gras, and actually, I remember this because they pushed all of the Mardi Gras parades that were scheduled for that weekend. They pushed it to the weekend before, because Mardi Gras is a 2-week thing down in New Orleans, and all of the parades and everything that was scheduled for the weekend of the Super Bowl was pushed up a week. So you had the parades, Mardi Gras parades and stuff, and then you had the Super Bowl week, and then right after the Super Bowl ended, Mardi Gras resumed.
And this was also during a very brief period where they weren't doing a bye week.
Yeah,
For whatever reason, I think it was like this year and like the following 2 years, maybe, they weren't doing the bye week. And so it wasn't even like they had the bye week to get rid of. They couldn't say, like, okay, we're going to, just hold the Super Bowl when we would have held it, but, bump everything. So they had, they couldn't shorten it because it was already no bye week. So they had to play the Super Bowl in February for the first time. And obviously, 9/11, understand what that meant and, why it had to be this way. But I don't like the way the NFL now feels like they need to extend the season all the way to the middle of February. That was always like the line in the sand previously. It was like, we don't want to play the Super Bowl in February. The Band-Aid has been ripped off now, and now it's, they've already moved it to the week before President's Day. And you know that what Goodell has his eye on is they want to figure out a way to get one more week in the season so that the Super Bowl can be played over President's Day weekend, and the next day's a holiday for a lot of people. So this Super Bowl represents kind of the beginning of a push that I think is going to end with a mid-February Super Bowl one day.
Right. The Rams, greatest show on turf. Kurt Warner was the league MVP. Marshall Faulk was the offensive NFL Player of the Year. By this time, you see this every now and then when you have a team that was as dominant as the Rams were, is that they become kind of not hated, but their shelf life was very short, But I think a lot of that had to do with the coach.
Martz.
Yeah.
Yeah, he wasn't liked. He was
a lot of that
Vermeil.
had to do with the coach because Martz just came off as someone that was kind of arrogant, and the team came off that way too. And then you have the New England Patriots, coached by Bill Belichick, and this young unknown quarterback named Tom Brady, who comes in there. And I remember this, and I said to myself, if the Patriots keep it close, they might have a chance. I remember saying that. Little did I know. They did more than keep it close.
And I'll say this: if this is the one I'm thinking of, Dana, didn't Brady get hurt in the playoffs and Breeze took over?
Yes, he got hurt in the AFC Championship game.
Bledsoe took over, and then here comes Belichick saying we're going to go with Brady. And I remember the warm up. Brady's all just dancing around, jumping around, and Bledsoe's like, "Stop."
Yeah. This was the last Super Bowl played in the Superdome before Hurricane Katrina. Mm-hmm. The Rams had beaten Green Bay 45-17, and then it beat the Eagles in the NFC Championship game 29-24. Meanwhile, the Patriots beat the Raiders in the Tuck Rule game 16-13, which spawned my dad's ultimate hatred of the Patriots, along with his hatred of the Steelers because of the Immaculate Reception. And then the Patriots end up beating the Steelers 21-17 in that game that we were just talking about. This was also very interesting. This was the first time that a matchup between St. Louis and Boston, and it happened. Those two cities have played each other in at least one championship round in all four major sports. Mm-hmm. Which I just found this out while doing research. I was like, that's true. I think that's the first time that had ever happened, where those two cities played each other in at least one World Series, one Super Bowl, one NBA Finals, one Stanley Cup Finals.
And it's significant in all of them because it was the first Celtics championship against the Hawks, against Russell.
Yeah.
It was when the Red Sox finally broke the curse.
Yeah.
In 2004, and then in 1970, it was the first
Bruins beating the.
It was the Bruins beating. It was the Bobby Orr.
Yeah, the Bobby Orr shot.
It's not just 4 championships, but it's 4 the biggest wins in Boston history.
Right, and then not only that, you had the 2 other times in the World Series where the Red Sox played the Cardinals. I think in '46, and then in '67.
67 was the Bob Gibson year, yeah.
Yeah. That and also another thing I want to touch on, the final drive of this game. I will always remember because there are 2 very significant things that happened. One, John Madden was very adamant in saying that the Patriots should be playing for overtime.
Yep. Yep. He kept saying, just play for overtime, play for overtime. And you see Tom Brady's like, no, I got this. I remember that. I remember Brady doing this, and Matt's like, play for overtime, play for overtime.
Another thing about it was this was the last telecast of the Summerall Madden
Mhm.
partnership.
Oh,
Yeah.
wow.
And it was almost like an afterthought. It was almost like a throwaway line. If you watch the final drive, Pat Summerall says, "While I have the opportunity, I'd like to say that it was an absolute pleasure working with John all these years on not starting off on CBS, but also working with Fox. It has been an absolute pleasure." And he says that during the drive is almost like, "Oh, by the way, let me say this real quick," you know. And then he keeps on calling it, and I'm like, "That is really smooth. That is really
He
smooth.
was an understated guy.
Very understated." And
Here,
then we all know what happens afterwards. You know, they get in field goal range. Vinatieri kicks the field goal. Patriots win 20-17. Do you guys consider that a major Super Bowl upset?
hmm, I would say this. It was a huge upset, but if the Rams had done a little bit more a year before that, like another Super Bowl run to it, I would say so. Because the Patriots shouldn't even been in that game.
I think it's kind of a knowing what we know now type of thing. It reminds me a little bit, not to switch sports again, but it reminds me a little bit of the Yankees with the Braves in '96, where at the
Yeah.
time you felt like it was a huge upset, and then you realize the Yankees went on to win three more World Series. So it's like, maybe not. It is really hard, and I think Dana, you were touching on a lot of this. It's really hard in retrospect to kind of explain two things to somebody who doesn't know it. First of all, the fact that the Patriots were ever a team that America was rooting for. That was
Yeah.
really hard to.
I was one of them.
So was I, and I was actually a freshman in college in Boston, and I remember talking to one of my friends. I had been at I was part of one of the pre-law groups, and we'd had a trip, and we were driving back to campus, and one of the girls on the in the group was she was a big Patriot fan, and she was talking about how excited she was to watch the Super Bowl and everything. And I said, "Look, I went through this a year ago with the Giants against the Ravens when my team made this Cinderella run to the Super Bowl, but don't get too excited because they're going to get smacked and you're going to wish you'd never gotten your hopes up because that's what happened to me the year before." And like you said, 14-point favorites. That's what everybody thought was going to happen. So it's hard for people to understand that. It was a team that was the defense was not great. It was a lot of carryovers from the Parcells years, and the offense was, I mean, Antoine Smith was probably their best offensive weapon. They really have, Troy Brown. The tight end is at least on Football Reference is a guy named Rod Rutledge, who I have to admit I do not remember. David Patton.
Yeah.
These were not offensive. These were not offensive firepowers by any means. And then, like you said, the Rams were such a juggernaut. They were, everybody thought the Rams were going to be the Patriots of the
Yeah.
next several years. So, yeah, at the
this
time, it was a shocking, shocking upset. I guess looking back, you see with Belichick and Brady, you're like, okay, these are the best coach and the best quarterback of all time. But I think at the time, yeah, tremendous, tremendous upset.
this right here, this Super Bowl, two things I remember about this. Belichick was telling that later on, I think it was during the America's game.
Yeah.
Might have been, I might be off on that. But he was talking about how, or it was talking about how he designed the defense, very similar to how he designed the defense against the Bills when he was a defensive coordinator for the Giants, is just hit them. As
Mm-hmm.
soon as they catch the ball, they were off the line a little bit more than normal in order for their Troy Hart, my mind went blank. The guys who would catch that their wide receivers are insane. How good they were, and then you
Torrey
have
Holt,
Marshall.
Isaac Bruce,
Yeah,
Isaac Hakeem,
yeah, all
Ricky
those.
Prohl.
Ricky Pro, yeah, and then you have Marshall Fox. So if I remember the defense correctly, they played off of them a little bit more than you would imagine to keep
Yeah.
them from going over the top. But as soon as they caught that ball, they hit them immediately. And
Right.
not only did they hit them to the point where two or three people would hit them, so it made them a little bit touchy. So if you look at the score, the Rams put up 14 points in the fourth quarter. That is comeback stuff. That's
Yeah.
comeback stuff. and the plays were a little bit different. But the way that the Patriots played them was stay off the line a little bit, hit them as soon as they catch the ball, and they didn't get those big plays.
Right.
But the one thing I remember about this, Dana, and again, go back to the halftime show, next to Prince, Prince was the best performance I've ever seen in a halftime show. Prince, period.
You're talking to a Prince fan. So
yeah, well,
yes.
you get me. Everybody else is wrong. You get me. The U2 performance when they did the names coming down from the sky.
Yeah, that was cool.
Oh my gosh.
That was
and
cool.
These are Irishmen singing about American tragedy because 9/11 was a tragedy for the whole world.
Yeah, that was really cool. I remember that. Now that you bring that up, now I do remember that.
It was dark and it was I think the names came down in blue. I might be again. And it's just
I could about imagine what it's going to be like this year with Kendrick Lamar. I really wonder what that's going to be like. I know my wife's looking forward to it.
My daughter is a huge Kendrick Lamar fan, and I'm like, I'll just take your word for it. I'll stick with my Dave Matthews, and we'll be all right.
All right. Now, the most recent Super Bowl to take place in New Orleans, and you want to talk about elaborate halftime shows.
Yeah.
Beyonce was this one, and this was Super Bowl. What was it? 47. I'm trying to read Roman numerals here.
48.
48. Okay. Super Bowl 48, Ravens, 49ers. The Harbaugh Bowl, or better known as we know it as New Orleans, the Blackout Bowl.
Yes.
Ravens 34, 49ers 31. This was like a lot like the Super Bowl 38 in a lot of ways. Here's why. Something that happened during the game which overshadowed a great game. In Super Bowl 38, which was the Patriots and Carolina Panthers, great game, one of the greatest Super Bowls ever that no one talks about. Do y'all remember why nobody talked about it?
About this game?
No, about Super Bowl 38. Carolina and New England.
Why it was Carolina? I don't remember.
I'm gonna mention one name and it's gonna bring you. It's gonna bring.
This is the Janet Jackson thing, of course.
Exactly.
Oh,
Janet Jackson.
Oh, I didn't.
It was a great game that no one talks about. This one right here is like that. Everybody talks about the blackout, which lasted for 35, 40 minutes. But it overshadowed a very, very good game. Ravens ended up winning this one 34-31 with the 49ers with a chance to win the game. They went for it on fourth down close to the end zone, I think from the 5-yard line. And it was a very, very memorable game. Unfortunately, it was overshadowed by the blackout.
So,
real quick, I'm sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. I misspoke. It was 47. So sorry, everybody.
You want to know some conspiracy? Because I believe that the NFL's already scripted this year's Super Bowl. I believe it's scripted. Taylor Swift 27, the Eagles 26. Okay, this is conspiracy. This is part of where it comes from. Because at this point, if I look at the score correctly, the Ravens were running away with it.
Yeah, they were.
And then it hit, and it resets, and look at what happens in the third quarter.
Yeah, a lot of people have said that. A lot of people have said that. You know, that was like a running joke, especially from people that's from Louisiana. This was like this was the second Super Bowl after I moved to Georgia. And most of the people that I watched the Super Bowl with were from Louisiana. There's this energy company called Entergy, and which basically is the soul's electric provider for the Superdome, and also all of Metro New Orleans. And the running joke was that the Superdome forgot to pay their energy bill because they have been known to shut people's electricity off on a Sunday. So I'm like, that's what happened. You know, that was like the running joke, you know, especially from people from Louisiana who actually understands that. That's what it became. It overshadowed a great game. It overshadowed the fact that you had two brothers coaching in a Super Bowl. John Harbaugh for the Ravens, who's still the coach now, and of course, Jim Harbaugh for the 49ers. First time you ever saw that really in any sport. I don't ever, I think that's the only time that has happened in any sport where two brothers coached against each other in a championship round.
Yeah, I mean, might have happened in 19th century baseball or something like that. But yeah, it for all intents and purposes, never happened. You're right.
This also, looking at the quarterbacks, they were less than stellar.
Yeah, yeah. Joe Flacco was the MVP, and you also on the other side you had Colin Kaepernick, with two quarterbacks who seem to be on the trajectory to have superstardom, almost Hall of Fame caliber careers, but both got derailed in different ways.
Flacco got drilled because they paid him a lot of money, and Kaepernick got drilled because of injuries and stuff like that.
I would point out that Flacco's still in the league. So
Yeah.
who knows?
I mean, because he was on a trajectory to become like a major,
Oh, yeah.
like a superstar,
Yeah.
Hall of Fame caliber quarterback.
But with a defense like the Ravens had, that's how the Ravens, to me, beat the Giants. Their defense is just insane. Still, was this Ray Lewis's last game?
This was Ray Lewis's last game, and I think
Ed Reed.
was that
Ed Reed
also
went to
Ed Reed's last game. I
No,
think too.
because Reed kind of bounced around a little bit. He was on the Jets for a year. He
Yeah,
might have been
Yeah,
no,
that's
but
right. That's
that was
right.
his last game with
he
the Ravens.
bounced around the NFL a little bit after this.
It was his last game with the Ravens, though, wasn't it? Ed Reed.
Yeah, and then he
I
actually
think so. I think so.
only one more season, and he split that between Houston and the Jets.
You know how weird it is to see Ed Reed? It's kind of like Ronnie Lott playing for the Jets. That's wrong.
Yeah.
This game right here was a lot. That score doesn't reflect how it would have been before the lights went out. It would have been
because Flacco had thrown 3 touchdown passes in the first half, and the Ravens
That's insane.
and the 49ers seemed like they just couldn't get out of their own way.
And
And
then
I do think, Dana, that's the reason why this isn't remembered as well. I don't think it's just because of the blackout, but I also think it's because of the blackout plus the way the game went, as
Yeah.
Jeremy was saying. And obviously, I was 30 years old, so I remember this game well. The thing about that game was it was like you were saying, Baltimore was dominating, and then after the blackout, it kind of felt like San Francisco rallied.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know. It's almost like, I don't know. Maybe I was wrong. It never really felt like Baltimore was actually going to lose. So it wasn't necessarily like a back and forth game the way some of these other ones were. So maybe that kind of, with the blackout, combined to make it feel not quite so close or not quite so memorable.
if the blackout didn't happen, that game could have been a 55-point game.
Maybe.
You're right.
You can't prove it one way or the other, but the way it was going, 21 points, 3 touchdowns. You think they were done? They weren't done.
They weren't done. I mean, and then plus you had Jacoby Jones with that kickoff return, 99-yard kickoff return. It was over 100 yards because he came out of the end zone with it and ran it back all the way. So I mean, you had that going right before the blackout.
That is it. By the way, he's an underrated player, Jacoby Jones. You need to look at him a little bit more.
Yeah.
You guys, you mentioned Ray Lewis. This was actually the last NFL game for another Hall of Famer. Do either of you know who I'm talking about?
Oh,
Was it Ray? It was Randy Moss.
Randy Moss,
Yeah.
who had
he
been
played for the
out
Raiders, or
of football the
49ers.
year before.
Yeah, it was
And
Randy
then for
Moss.
whatever reason decided to come back for one season as basically like a role player for the 49ers. And it was like, wow, Randy Moss is back in the league and in the Super Bowl. So
Well, it's
I've always
kinda
thought that
weird.
was funny how after like all these years where he was like a headline guy. And I think in his second to last year, so Randy Moss, he was on the Vikings and then Oakland, and then he went to the Patriots and had a couple of amazing years with Brady, but then they got sick of him. And then in 2010, he was on
Titans.
3 different teams. He was on the Patriots, then briefly on the Vikings, then on Tennessee.
yeah. I remember that big deal.
Yeah, well, you probably do remember that, Jeremy. Yeah, because he finished up with the Titans, right?
Yeah.
And so he like wore out his welcome on 3 different teams over the course of a season, and everybody just thought his career was over. And then he just kind of quietly resigns after a year off. Quietly resigns with the 49ers for just one last hurrah, and in
They
the
go to the
process
Super Bowl.
almost wins the Super Bowl.
Yeah, I remember that now. He looked weird in red and gold. He's
Uh-huh.
he's a Viking to me for and a
Yeah.
Patriot.
I mean, whenever I think of Randy Moss, I think of the Purple '84. Him teaming up with Chris Carter.
98.
And that was one, again, another offensive juggernaut that these eyes of mine had remember, and was like maybe some of the greatest I'd ever seen.
And just on the subject of Hall of Famers, there's going to be another one because Frank Gore was on this 49er team, and he's third all time in rushing yards with exactly 16,000. So
He should be in.
as soon as he's eligible, he'll be in.
He should
Yeah.
be in. You think, well, he was in there long term. His longevity got him. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. What's the point? What's that an argument against Frank Gore?
There can't be an argument because Frank Gore may be the most durable running back I've ever seen.
Most
Maybe next to Peyton.
most games played at running back in NFL history.
He came, wasn't he? I might be off. I might be thinking of Portis. Wasn't he injured when he came out of Miami and still did what he did? No, I might be thinking of somebody
The
else.
thing of Clinton Portis.
Clint Portis. I was thinking of Clint Portis. Gore was so, people never really talked about him, and then he does what he does.
Right. No, not Clinton Portis.
Willis McGee.
Willis McGahee.
Willis McGahee. Yeah, that's who it was. It was in the
Willis McGahee
Orange
got
Bowl.
hurt in the national championship game against Ohio State.
Yep, Willis McGahee, and he did all right too with the Ravens.
Yeah.
And Frank Gore, I'm looking at his stats here. Another guy who spent his last season with the Jets before retiring. So that's
Did he ever win a Super Bowl?
No.
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 Do
This is his only Super Bowl appearance. Frank Gore.
Because here's the thing, Derrick Henry's my favorite player in the NFL right now. I can't stand he went to Ravens, but whatever. He probably won't win a Super Bowl. Does that take off on a running back's career?
Not as much as it would be a quarterback. Not
Yeah.
as much. Because we still consider, even though he had a terrible toward the end of his, well, the second half of his life, people can still consider O.J. Simpson one of the greatest running backs of all time, but he only played in one playoff game.
Barry Sanders.
Barry Sanders is another great example.
I feel like running back is one of those positions where big performances and championships can help, but they really don't count against you. Whereas a quarterback's job is to go out there and win the game.
Right.
And if he doesn't do that, then that's a mark against him in sort of the last 50, over the last 50 years of the NFL, at least. It's not as much for a running back. I mean, I don't think we don't think of Joe Thomas as any less of an offensive tackle because he never made it to the playoffs, because an offensive tackle can't get you to the playoffs. Running backs can do it a little more, but no, I think for quarterbacks, certainly for guys in other sports, hockey, basketball, absolutely.
Yeah.
For running backs, I don't think so.
Okay, so think about this, tying it all together. Jim Plunkett became Jim Plunkett because of the Super Bowls.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Joe Flacco got a lot of money for this Super Bowl. You go back and you think about it. How did Kurt Warner become Kurt Warner? It was the Super Bowl against against that team, but Joe Montana was. It's not funny. Don't laugh. Joe Montana was established already.
Yeah.
He was good. Steve Young was established. So a lot of these games, like you're talking about, if that was Colin Kaepernick winning the Super Bowl, would his trajectory change and Joe Flacco gone down?
That's another interesting question. If we took everything like from forgetting everything that happened from that point forward, forgetting all of that, putting that aside, I really think that had Kaepernick brought that team back and won that game against the Ravens, it would be completely different because he was on the trajectory of being a superstar quarterback, we probably would be talking about Kaepernick the same way we talk about maybe Lamar Jackson now. Think about
Jackson's won multiple MVPs, and Kaepernick was never.
it. Who knows? Who knows?
But Kaepernick had the best head of hair I've ever seen in a quarterback up until that point.
I had hair like that once upon a time.
Oh, I got to see pictures, Danny. You need to see me. I respect the hair game. I really do.
And look, I mean, it's rarer. It's much rarer for teams to turn their, and obviously there was, other things at play with Kaepernick, but it's rarer for teams to turn their back on quarterbacks that win them a Super Bowl as opposed to just take them to one. So yeah, it's an interesting counterfactual, definitely.
Well, guys, I really appreciate you coming on, man, to have this Super Bowl celebration of the Louisiana Superdome. We're now the Caesar Superdome, but I still call it the Louisiana Superdome.
Keep in mind, my prediction is Taylor Swift 27, Eagles 26.
Okay, let's do that then. Dan, what's your Super Bowl prediction? I'm putting you on the spot here.
I'm gonna say I actually don't think it's gonna be a super high-scoring game. I'm gonna say Chiefs 24, Philly 14.
Actually, I have the Eagles winning this one. 2017, Saquon Barkley MVP.
I think at heart of hearts, I think that if the Eagles are allowed to play, Saquon Barkley is going to be as dominant as some of the other guys that I've ever seen in the Super Bowl.
He's single-handedly bringing back the running back position.
Him and Henry's this year. Good gracious!
Yeah, they're single-handedly they're bringing back the running back to the NFL.
That was what I was hoping for. I was hoping for. I mean, it's hard for me because I'm a Giant fan, and I therefore hate both the Ravens and the Eagles. But I was kind of hoping for a Ravens-Eagles Super Bowl because it could be like. It's got to be and I know it wasn't this year for Derrick Henry, but it would have to be the first time that two 2,000-yard single-season running backs.
First time you have two 2,000-yard running backs in the face off against each other in the Super Bowl. That would have been incredible. But guys, I really appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedules to sit down with me to reminisce and about these Super Bowls, and which is my favorite, my second favorite event of the year next to the Final Four. But I really appreciate you coming on, man. And guys, and any last minute thoughts or?
Just be careful and stay safe, y'all. Stay safe.
Right.
Love yourself.
And I just want to thank you, Dana, as always, for bringing us together like this, and that this was a lot of fun. I know I've done things with each of you before, but I don't think the three of us have done something together. So this was cool, a cool little combination tonight.
Yeah, that's one of the things I wanted to do, man. But I'm glad each one of you had the opportunity to come on, and thank you guys for showing up.
Thank you, Dana.
Thank you both.
Coming up after the break, we will send a shout out to the stadium that was known as the Sugar Bowl. Of course, we're talking about Tulane Stadium. It was the original home of both the annual New Year's Day bowl game and the New Orleans Saints from their entrance into the NFL in the late 1960s to the opening of the Superdome in the 1970s. It was also the site of 3 Super Bowls in the early 1970s, including the final NFL game played at the stadium. The story of the stadium, known as the Old Lady of Willow Street, here on the Sports History Network's Historically Speaking Sports podcast.
At the Sports History Network, we're all about the sports yesteryear, and so we're pleased to introduce you to Row 1, an online memorabilia gallery and shop that brings sports history to life. The Row 1 gallery features over 5,200 gorgeously reproduced prints of team posters, game program covers, game tickets, and advertisements in baseball, pro and college football, pro and college basketball, and more. Any gallery item may be printed in a variety of sizes on wood, metal, canvas, acrylic, or poster paper. It's your choice. In the Row 1 shop, you can pick from thousands of unique items that feature retro and historical backgrounds dating back to 1876. We have everything from clothing to phone cases to mugs, even shower curtains. Go to sportshistorynetwork.com/Row 1 for access to the full Row 1 catalog. When you buy from the gallery today, you can instantly save 15% on your purchase. All you have to do is enter the code SHN15 and your discount will be applied. That's SHN15. That's it. Simple. Save 15% off all your prints in the Row 1 gallery. Just go to sportshistorynetwork.com/row1. And don't forget to check out all the podcasts on the Sports History Network. Soundtrack provided by Kevin MacLeod of filmmusic.io.
You are locked into Historically Speaking Sports Podcast, a member of the Sports History Network. And just a reminder out there, you could follow us on various different social media platforms such as Blue Sky and Threads and X. Just search for Historically Speaking Sports to find us for new daily sports history moments and content. Also, fans could write to the show and also float some possible show ideas to us. If you like, you could also just say hello. So you could write to us at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. Once again, that email address is historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. On Sunday, November 8th, 1970, the New Orleans Saints were playing the Detroit Lions in a regular season game at the Saints' home field of Tulane Stadium. The Saints were behind 17-16 after Lions kicker Errol Mann connected on a late field goal to give a late lead and presumably the game to Detroit. The Saints got the ball down one and just needed to get the ball into field goal territory. And after a couple of completions by then Saints quarterback Billy Kilmer got the ball to midfield with less than 5 minutes remaining, Saints coach J.D. Roberts called in Tom Dempsey for both a dramatic and desperate field goal from an unthinkable distance of 63 yards away, far and away the longest field goal in NFL history at the time. Now, to give you an idea how far the kick was, even with the goalpost on the goal line instead of it where it is now placed at the end line, the hold by Joe Scarpati was placed on the Saints' 37-yard line. The snap was perfect, the hold flawless, and when Dempsey connected with the ball, there was an audible boom like a cannon going off, and the ball sailed through the very humid air of New Orleans and just by a couple of feet cleared the crossbar to give the Saints a 19-17 win for their second win and would ultimately be their second and final win of the season. For most of the existence of the Saints, this was the landmark red-letter moment in Saint history. It was also the greatest and most famous moment for a stadium that went by a number of different nicknames, such as the Sugar Bowl, the Queen of the Southern Stadiums, and the Old Lady of Willow Street. Tulane Stadium opened in 1926 as the home stadium for Tulane University, already a national power in college football at the time. Its seating capacity when it opened was 35,000, and after a number of expansions and renovations, it reached 80,000 plus by the mid-1950s. The stadium itself was built on the campus of Tulane University, which before its opening in 1871 was a portion of a property owned by Paul Forchet, who was the son-in-law of Etienne de Boré, who invented the process of granulating sugar from cane syrup, hence the name the Sugar Bowl. The first Sugar Bowl game was played at the stadium on January 1st, 1935, matching host Tulane versus Temple here in New Orleans. The term Sugar Bowl had been coined by Fred Digby, a sports editor of the New Orleans Item, who had been pushing for an annual New Year's Day bowl game since 1927. The record attendance for the stadium was set on December 1st, 1973, when 86,598 fans watched Tulane beat in-state rival LSU 14-0, ending a 25-year winless streak for the Green Wave against the Bayou Bengals. It was also the last time that LSU and Tulane had played each other on the Tulane campus. A month later, a Sugar Bowl record crowd of 85,161 watched Notre Dame edge Alabama 24-23 in the first meeting between these two traditional powers, allowing the Fighting Irish to capture the AP National Championship. 1 year later, Tulane Stadium hosted its final Green Wave game, a 26-10 loss to Ole Miss on November 30th, 1974. It would be 40 years before Tulane would play in an on-campus game when Yulman Stadium opened in 2014. For the first 7 years of the New Orleans Saints, the Black and Gold called Tulane Stadium home. In their first game in franchise history, a sold-out crowd of over 80,000 saw John Gilliam return the opening kickoff in franchise history for a 94-yard touchdown and a 27-13 loss to the LA Rams. Another highlight of the Saints during their time at Tulane Stadium was on opening day of the 1971 season. When the Saints, down by 3 with less than a minute to play, the Saints scored on a late 2-yard touchdown run on the brand new AstroTurf of Tulane Stadium by a rookie quarterback from Ole Miss named Archie Manning. In addition to hosting Tulane football, the Sugar Bowl, and the Saints, Tulane Stadium was the host of 3 of the first 9 Super Bowls. It was the site of Super Bowl IV when the Kansas City Chiefs defeated the Minnesota Vikings 24-7 to give a triumphant end to the American Football League. 2 years later, the Dallas Cowboys won their first Super Bowl at Tulane Stadium, dominating the Dolphins 24-3. Incidentally, the temperature at kickoff was 36 degrees, making it the coldest Super Bowl on record. It was even colder than Super Bowl 48, where the Seahawks defeated the Broncos in East Rutherford, New Jersey. Then 3 years later, Super Bowl IX, the final NFL game in the stadium. The Steelers won their first Super Bowl, beating the Vikings 16-6 in a cold and rainy evening in the Big Easy. In 1975, the day the new Louisiana Superdome opened, Tulane Stadium was officially condemned. Upon appeal by the university, the older concrete and brick lower bowl section was deemed fit to use. However, the newer metal upper deck was declared unsafe. It had rusted badly due to 36 years of exposure to New Orleans' humid climate. The stadium had then continued in more limited use for 5 years with the smaller seating area used for football practice, high school games, and other smaller events. Louisiana High School football traditional power John Curtis Christian won Louisiana High School Athletic Association's Class A state championship games there in 1977 and in 1978. The last football game at the stadium was prior to its demolition was between 2 New Orleans Catholic League teams as Chalmette High School beat Jesuit on November 3, 1979. The final touchdown was a 9-yard pass from Keith Mason to Craig Steber with 4:08 remaining, giving Chalmette the 23-9 win. The day before, November 2, 1979, Tulane President Sheldon Hackney announced that the stadium would be demolished. The demolition started on November 18, 1979 and ended in June of 1980. While the storage areas underneath the seating of the stadium were being emptied prior to demolition, various neglected university possessions were rediscovered, including an ancient Egyptian mummy couple. The site of the former stadium is now home to the Aaron and Willow student housing complexes, the Diebold parking structure, the Riley Students Recreation Center, and the Brown Quad. Sports fans, that will do it for this special edition of the Historically Speaking Sports Podcast. Thank you guys for taking time out of your day to give us a listen. This podcast comes to you from the Bill King Memorial Studio in the sports wing of TM4 Enterprises, located in suburban Atlanta in the shadow of Stone Mountain. To get more content of the Historically Speaking Sports, you can check us out on Blue Sky and Threads and X. And if you'd like to, please send us a line here at historically.speaking.sports@gmail.com. If you have not done so already, please subscribe to the show. Tell your family, tell your friends, tell your neighbors, hell, tell a passerby on the street about us if you think they like sports history. And until our next episode, stay blessed, stay cool, and be your best at everything that you do. It will make the world a much better place. Peace.
Hey there, sports history fan. This is Arnie Chapman, aka the Football History Dude, and I hope that you enjoyed this recent episode presented by the Sports History Network and we're able to learn some good old-fashioned sports history knowledge nuggets. I started the Sports History Network back in 2020 with the mission to help podcasters find a community of like-minded sports history nerds, as well as helping aspiring podcasters to start their own shows. We have a little bit over 30 shows on the network right now covering all sorts of sports history, but as far as I'm concerned, we're just at the toothpick in the ocean moment, that can't even figure it out because there's so much more coming. We wanted to create the ultimate headquarters for sports yesteryear, starting with Podcast Network and our website, but we're going to continue to move into other mediums as well. And here's the cool part, because we want you to be part of our team. So if you're interested in starting your own podcast, or maybe being a guest on one of our shows, or who knows, maybe even writing an article for us over on the website. Seriously, all you gotta do is reach out to us on the contact page over at sportshistorynetwork.com. You can be as technologically savvy as a Neanderthal tapping on a stone trying to figure out this whole hieroglyphics thing back in the day. Again, it doesn't matter, because even if you don't understand the whole podcast space, we have a production team that can pretty much help you out with doing everything. All you gotta do, head over to sportshistorynetwork.com, head to the contact page, fill it out. That message goes right to me, and I'll reach out to you as soon as I can. But for now, dude, I'm through if you're through.